The Great Reset. Has it ever happened before? And the answer is yes. The most recent example would be March 6, 1933, when the then sitting President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, shut the commercial banking system down overnight. Mums and dads went to sleep on March 5th, only to awaken and find that the commercial banking system had completely shut down and failed on March 6. Between the years 1929 and 1933, the United States would undergo a total economic collapse. Following the roaring 20s and the credit boom, the stock market would fail between 1929 and 1932 by 90%. 9 million consumer accounts would be wiped from the ledger. 10,000 commercial banks would fail. The only asset to survive and be in the black during that period was physical gold, which of course the Federal Treasury confiscated under Executive Order 6102 on April the 5th, 1933, giving people just 26 days to bring their precious gold bullion back to the commercial banks. And if people didn't take their gold back to the banks, they would be charged with terrorism under Trading Secrets of the Enemy Act of 1917. Following the confiscation of gold, which of course was the only asset that had any value, and following the complete shutdown of the commercial banking system, the common man had nothing. This laid the groundwork for something called the New Deal, where Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration would create the institutions of the Securities Exchange Commission to oversee future stock market failures. And of course the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in 1933. But it was in the January of the following year, 1934, in the Gold Reserve Act, where Franklin D. Roosevelt once again dealt a savage blow, together with his administration, to the common man, by first of all banning the trading of gold. Anything over 5 ounces could not be held and gold could not be traded. That would stay like that right up until the 1st of the 1st, 1975, when the act would be repealed by the non-elected President of the United States, Gerald Ford, who took over, of course, from Nixon, Richard Nixon. But also in the January of 1934, Franklin D. Roosevelt would devalue the US dollar by 59% overnight, simply by re-evaluating the price of the US dollar against gold. It was confiscated at $20.67 an ounce, but in the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 in the January, it was indexed at $35 an ounce. This would pave the way for the total destruction of the middle classes for decades. Soon, the United States would fall into decline, to something called the Great Depression. There were food shortages, mass unemployment, huge amounts of loss of confidence within the consumer class. And then war, the outbreak of war in Europe, 1939 to 1945. 1939 at least saw the end of the League of Nations. But by the end of the war in 1945, we saw the rise of the United Nations. Just shortly before that, in the July of 1944, after the Normandy landings, a group of businessmen in suits, 44 allied nations, would meet at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to put the United States onto the gold standard for the first time, virtually since its collapse in 1933. But this gold standard was not a gold standard of the people. It was a gold standard of the elites, because the people couldn't trade gold. So now, the US dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, tradable only at the wholesale level. Then we find, just shortly after the Second World War, that more gold was mined since 1950 than virtually any other time in history, at a time when the common man couldn't even own it. The Federal Reserve would form an accord with the Treasury in the United States in 1951 to give them more power. This, of course, led on to many more wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. Then towards the end of the 1960s, the US dollar had begun to fail. And the French, seemingly under the Bretton Woods system, wanted to exercise their rights to get gold, not the US dollars. But the US did not want to do this, and they only really had two options. They either had to give the then sitting president of France, de Gaulle, the gold that they presumably had in their vaults that backed the currency, or they had to get off the standard altogether to prevent themselves from revealing the hard truth that they probably didn't actually have the physical gold they claimed they had. Which is essentially why one Apollo moon landing later, we had, of course, in 1971, Nixon on August 15, take the United States off the gold standard altogether. And it was a wholesale gold standard, of course. He took them off the Bretton Woods system, so the convertibility of US dollars to gold essentially ended, thus saving the day for the United States. But of course, the fundamental problem was that this left the US dollar as a free-floating currency. And it wasn't until 1974 when Kissinger did a deal with Saudi Arabia to create an oil-backed dollar called the petrodollar that the US dollar seemed to start to stabilise a little bit more and become less volatile. Between the years 1944 and 1971, all countries around the world traded unilaterally on the US dollar. But after the Bretton Woods system ended in 1971, it was a free-for-all. It became a free-floating currency. Countries could peg to it or not. Then, of course, in 1975, as I mentioned, Gerald Ford repealed the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 and allowed the common man to trade gold for the first time in nearly 40 to 50 years. This, of course, saw the rapid rise of gold, many hundreds of percent through the 1970s. And of course, now we see in 2024 the rise of the Brics nations in counter to the US dollar. The United States, throughout its reign as the world reserve currency, could be argued that they were simply a bully. They used their dollar to punish nations through sanctions. They set up the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in 1944, both very, very sharp and powerful tools which they used, again, for sanctioning and for the betterment of the United States, but to the detriment of nations. And the Brics nations now, of course, formed in 2011, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, have had enough, voting with their feet against the US dollar. Now, to become a member of Brics, you virtually have to be prepared to denounce the US dollar, something which Javier Milei of Argentina was not prepared to do, as he came under enormous pressure from the United States to withdraw his membership, which he, of course, did. Which leaves now 10 nations, as of the 1st of the 1st, 2024, that have full Brics membership. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, United Arab Emirates, and of course Saudi Arabia. These are some of the most commodity-rich and powerful nations on the planet, and there's another 34 nations that have applied to be part of Brics. The United States dollar is in a world of trouble. The only plausible way forward is to move to digital currencies. But the war on digital is only just beginning. So too is the war on oil. As China becomes preferenced by Saudi Arabia on the 1st of the 1st, 24 as the Chinese yuan instead of the petro yuan, the petro renminbi, instead of the petrodollar. This, of course, has caused conflict in the Middle East. And all focus is now on one of the biggest OPEC nations, the fourth biggest oil producer in the world, Iran. The focus is on the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, and the warships that were sent to put pressure on a peaceful nation such as Iran, whose only crime in this is that they are 1, a Brics nation, 2, an OPEC nation, and 3, one of the biggest suppliers of oil to China through the roads of Pakistan. As I've mentioned previously, it is almost impossible for the United States to go to war against China, or Russia for that matter, or the UK or France. because they hold full veto power on the board of the United Nations, something which they have held for some time. So it's unlikely that the United States could ever mount a plausible war against China. But what they can do is hurt Iran. So this is why you were seeing conflict rising in the Middle East, because the US dollar is at the end of its reign. The only possibility for the United States dollar from here is to either move, as I said, to fully digital, or look to the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights currency, which is a basket of the top 5 currencies of the last 5 years. If the United States cannot achieve this, who knows where we will go from here. This is all coupled with the move to tokenization, which will involve, of course, the new gold of the new era. Unlike the 1930s, gold is no longer the asset of choice. Gold is not what will be confiscated here. It is securities, your housing titles, equitable interests that the commercial bank put up as collateral against positions on the derivatives markets. Those derivatives markets are $5 quadrillion in size. And if they fail, your titles are owned by new custodians who plan to pull those titles and then trade them through digital assets corporations on Wall Street via investors. Property in the future will not be owned, it will be investor owned. No one will own it. It'll be owned by everybody. And behind that system is the Digital Twin Cities program, which involves surveillance, the Internet of Things, the smart grid, the carbon credit system. This is why I have talked about mitigating all risk and making a move to the very assets that are going to drive these systems. XRP, XLM, IOTA, HBAR, Quant, ADA. These are all technologies that will drive this new world. I've also spoken about keeping physical cash on hand, even though we will be going cashless at some point in our evolution. I've also spoken about keeping physical gold and silver as your bedrock substrate. This is your wealth preservation system and will serve you well across a reset. We have never been through a reset with digital assets before. We have no idea what that would look like or how it would play out, which is why you need to have physical commodities within your possession to lower your counterparty risk and mitigate against all risk. Having cash or currency in a commercial banking institution is a high-risk situation. Having physical cash at home is a medium to low-risk situation, but having physical commodities of gold and silver is zero counterparty risk. Holding digital assets is volatile. We have no idea how this will play. But whatever it is you decide to do and however it is you decide to live your life, make sure that you assess all risk, you mitigate, and you diversify. You account for all possibilities. And as I always say, look after your health. That's your number one non-negotiable. Look after your loved ones and your family. That's the only reason we're here. And of course, as always, make good choices.